This is NEGOTIATEx TV.
Hello and welcome to the NEGOTIATEx podcast. I'm your co-host and co-founder, Nolan Martin. With me today is my co-host, co-founder, good friend. What else can I throw on there, Aram?
I don't know. We'll have to work. I need to improve your list of adjectives there to describe me.
There we go.
Since I know what you're going to do, you're going to kick it over me to introduce our guest. Yeah, I'm gonna go ahead and do that. Author, speaker, and executive coach Dr. Belinda Chiu focuses on individuals and organizations to co-create healthier ecosystems and cultivate authenticity. Founder of Hummingbird Research Coaching Consulting, Belinda brings over 20 years of experience in leadership development and training, executive coaching, consulting, public diplomacy, and higher education to be a catalyst for leaders of diverse experiences so they may be of greatest service to others. She works with a wide range of organizations such as Burberry, ESPN, Headspace, Paramount Plus, Regeneron, Sony, Stanford, and UN Ops. An International Coaching Federation professional certified executive coach, Belinda works with individuals at all levels, from the C+ suite to emerging leaders. She also engages at organizational levels to build more inclusive and equitable global teams. She serves as a visiting faculty member and coach for the Tuck School of Business's Executive Education Program, MBA and MHDS programs, Dartmouth's Leads Program for High Potentials, and Rockefeller Center's Management and Leadership Development Program. She is also a certified teacher for the Search Inside Yourself Leadership Institute, a faculty member with the Inner MBA, teaching fellow with True North Leadership, and Mind Gym coach. Additionally, she is an international liaison with the U.S. Department of State, advises EI Focus to cultivate female leaders through sports and emotional intelligence, and is a board member of Music to Life. She is the author of numerous publications, a certified yoga teacher and forest guide, and improv member. Belinda holds a bachelor's degree from Dartmouth College, a master's from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, and a doctorate from Columbia University. She's based here in New Hampshire, where I am too, with Bandit, the pink-nosed puppy, aka Queen Amygdala. I don't know if we'll see an appearance from Bandit today. Belinda, thanks so much for joining us.
It's absolutely my pleasure, and thank you for that introduction. So I thought a little humbly to kind of like, oh, okay, all right,
First question I had for you is, with everything in your bio, everything you're doing, how do you find time to even visit with us today?
Because you're wonderful, and I love talking to people about this work, and I love people who also recognize that my dog, who, yes, Queen Amygdala, I just came back from a 2.5 week trip, and she, most dogs, like, you kind of want that welcome, and they kiss you, that welcome home. She literally ran by me 3 times, and she wouldn't look at me for about 20 minutes. He was so mad at me. He was so mad at me.
I'm sure she'll get over that fairly quickly this afternoon, evening. So I hope so anyways.
So thank you again, Belinda, for joining us. So you and your company, Hummingbird, bring together this wonderful combination of academic research with real world coaching and consulting. Can you share with us a little about the journey that has taken you to where you are today and the work that you're currently involved with?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, boy, how much time do we have? I think a lot of, folks and colleagues that I work with, engage with, probably would have a very similar answer, in that nothing's fully ever planned. As one of my dear coaches, they talked about the squiggly career in many ways. And so I think that's been both a combination of a lot of luck, and a great deal of being very fortunate to be around some incredible mentors and colleagues, and just people who have supported me along the way. It sounds really cheesy when I say that, but it is actually very true. And so being able to really kind of merge a lot of my interests, both, I've always sort of sat in the in-betweens, like my whole life, I think, has been the in-between, whether it's in between cultures, whether it's in between spaces, of whether it's the corporate world and the academic world. I've always sort of, I always say, when you don't belong anywhere, when you're raised sort of kind of where you don't belong, you end up belonging everywhere. And so that's sort of what I've always embraced, is just sort of being comfortable in that space in between. And not willing, quite probably my need for a lot of different, interests and things like that, and short attention span, that all helps in terms of not willing to give up too many things quite yet.
I would assume that allows you then to be able to fit and fill spaces with a lot of different types of organizations and people as well. So my guess is it serves you incredibly well in the work you do.
Yeah, I think in some ways it's not easy. I'm still trying to figure it out. I'm still always trying to figure out what I want to be when I grow up. And I do think there is sort of space and need for all types of individuals in terms of, for some folks, and I've always admired those who really know where there's that one thing that they just grab onto. And I have such admiration for that. And I remember when I was younger, I thought, that's what I need to do as well, grab on that one thing. And I just couldn't do it. It just didn't quite feel right to me until I really started to appreciate how we do need every, different pieces. And so even though at sometimes I'm still trying to work through that, but more and more it may seem disparate, but there's so many dots. And one thing I love doing, and this kind of perhaps aligned with that spaces in between, is how do you connect the dots? Because the academic world and the corporate world we think are so different, or C-suite leaders versus, these young activists that I just came off this 2-week trip of. You think they're different, but we're not. We're all dealing with such similar struggles and fears and issues. And it's how do we connect the dots, not just amongst people, but also with this greater world in which we live in.
Well, a major focus of the work that you do with students and clients revolves around this concept of a compassion strategy. Can you tell us a little bit about what that is exactly, and maybe why it's so needed as we sit here in the year 2023?
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting because the word compassion has always been in some ways part of how I grew up, but not really understanding what does this mean. And I think I probably always, and I'm, kind of continue to investigate, what does this mean in 2023, right? I think is a lot of times there's this understanding that compassion is this, as I say, soft, squishy concept of like, okay, we're all, going to go meditate on a mountaintop and be friends forever. And while I would love to have us all be friends forever and play dogs all the time, I think of cartoons. But, I think one of the key pieces, as we know right now, whether it's, the state of politics, whether it's the state of our environment, whether it's the state of race relations, all of these things that are very real. Compassion, and as we now understand more from the neuroscientists who are studying this, it's not just sort of a nice to have concept or this sort of fluffy thing, but a very real neurobiological sort of skill that we should all cultivate so that we can acknowledge the good, the bad, the ugly that is in front of us, not shy away from us, but still be able to show up with humanity and show up with that really applied empathy, right? Empathy in action, towards, again, not just human beings, but of course, all the other sort of beings that we inhabit, and everything that we do impacts others, and all of that.
Absolutely. And one thing that we'd like to do is kind of dive more deeply into the components of your compassion strategy. The first is centeredness. What is that exactly? And why is it difficult for so many leaders to be centered?
Yeah. So centeredness, it's interesting because this is a phrase that Bain actually sort of started to use, and I like alliteration, so the 3 C's. But really when we're talking about centeredness, it's mindfulness plus. And I know in the last, I would say 5 years, maybe even more than that, 10 years, mindfulness has become much more accepted in the workplace, because, I think before that it was sort of like, it's, again, something nice to have in a retreat center or in the large spaces, but more and more there's this greater acceptance that this is absolutely critical to how we lead and how we show up in the workplace. When I think about working with leaders, and also being in that role myself a couple of times, is I will say, that the ability to understand how we choose where our attention goes, how we choose to show up for ourselves and others, and how do we become more comfortable with what's going on inside, right, requires us to be present. And I think, and it's not so simple as in being present, just, of course, it's being present in the moment, but it's beyond that, right? It's really having choice of how do we bring our capacity to really consider what's the wisest decision in this moment that I can make, right? Because when we think about, and there's more and more, like Dan Goleman, for example, from who I've had the honor of working with, others have shown that technical skills will only get us so far, right? So I started my career as a consultant. I was an econ major, I was a political philosophy major, right? But learning how to mock, those are things that I learned in the workplace. And I was very fortunate to have a great environment that let me do that. And so the technical skills we can learn, we can teach. These other aspects of how do you manage yourself, how do you manage others around you, those are all the things that are not always taught in school, right? Those aren't, and to me, one of my pet peeves is that it's called soft skills. And, my thing is, what is soft about working with human beings? What is soft about managing all the, think about all the stories we tell about ourselves, all the things that trip us up in terms of being able to make wise decisions. Because as leaders, our decisions don't just impact us. It has this huge ripple effect on all those, not just around us, but those longer term impacts years down the line.
Yeah, nothing soft there at all. And it's hard because even where to start sometimes and pulling back the layers of that onion, which is myself, right? And so difficult, the things that get in the way of me being present.
Absolutely. I love that analogy you also said about sort of peeling back the onions, right? Because there's this, interestingly, a pushback. There's been a recent article about how mindfulness is really selfish, right? And I think this is where compassion has to come in, because I think sometimes there's this misunderstanding too that mindfulness is, well, it's self-awareness. I'm aware of myself. And so then we can get really internal, right, about the work. But compassion really allows us to actually, it's about showing up. It's about action, right? It's about seeing this. Being mindful is sort of the root, is search inside yourself, which is started at Google, really looked at. Mindfulness is really sort of the foundation of it. Now it's how do we then use that in action? Because it's not just about the internal self, but it's about how do I internally understand what's going on so that I can impact others in the world around me in a way that hopefully leaves it better than not.
That is tough. That is tough work. As you talk about centeredness, seen in your work, this idea of purposeful play, right, as a component of centeredness, you define it as mindfulness plus. And I can imagine that some of the clients that you work with or students are like, hey, listen, I'm a manager of people. I don't have time for play, Belinda. So what do you mean by purposeful play? And how does that equip us to, lead others and lead our organizations more effectively?
Absolutely. It's funny because that word play, and I will say, it took me probably a while to fully embrace that part of it, because it's always been very important to me. But sort of, when I'm 20 something years old and, trying to be taken seriously amongst mostly, male dominated sort of, atmosphere, I wasn't going to be like, oh, let's play. But as well, and think about sort of where we are, right? In this world where there's so much chaos, so much uncertainty, we don't know we have no idea what's going to, like day by day, I'm like, well, it's going to show up now in the news. And a lot of times we forget to play in this, and remember, it's purposeful play. It's not playing just for the heck of like having fun, which is also important, but maybe not in the workplace. But this sense of play is critical for us to actually be open to this chaos that is around us. And as I was saying to someone yesterday, it's not about being chaotic. As leaders, we have to actually be able to manage chaos. And in order to manage chaos, there has to be order, right? So in order to be able to play, we have to have structure. So that's why it has to be very intentional purpose, because until you you can't really experiment unless you understand your core, right? Just like you can't really sort of think about, improv. So I do study improv as well. I'm not very good at it, but I really enjoy it. And for me, but improv is so important. Like I keep doing it because it keeps my skills, or I try to keep my skills, really sort of sharpened so that I can respond in the moment. And I always encourage any leader, take an improv class. And they're like, what? I'm like, just take an improv class. And I remember we had one session where we would tell the leaders that it was an improv class because we say that people would run away. So we just called it a leadership session. We had so much fun, right? We had a lot of fun, but there's actually real sort of skill building around it, because there's and Robert Quinn who's a professor, has really talked about these 4 fundamental states of leadership. And so much of leadership is being other focused. It's being results focused. It's really being able to play in that way of creating, innovating. And creating, innovating isn't creating something out of nothing necessarily. It's sort of taking what we have and seeing the possibilities. So that play becomes critical. And again, play is not without intention. It's intentional play, but it also enables us to also come to different situations and with people with an open mind. Because when you look at children, they don't have preconceived notions about things. They just see something, they're like, hey, let's like whatever. And there's that famous study of, what is it? Is it the marshmallow, the spaghetti or the marshmallow test, right? Where they take MBA students and they take kindergartners, and who does it better? The kindergartners, right? Because the kindergartners are like, oh, let's just figure it out. And we just have to be, and we have to have a strategy and we have to think about it. And they get tripped up, right? And we all do as we get older. So part of the play is to invite us to look at things with that beginner's mind, which is connected to mindfulness, of course, and centeredness. But how we approach things with a different mind so that I'm challenging those stories and assumptions I have about myself, I have about you, you have about me, right? Think about the listeners here, right? We all have stories now created already about what I'm saying, about what you're saying. We all have stories. How do I interrupt those? Well,
I loved how you laid that out. It made me think about Legos for a moment, because my kids love to play with Legos, the creativity involved there, this purposeful play. And so much of it starts with the structure of an instructions that they get to build something. And then where it goes from there, this creative, innovative approach, to create other things. And it's always amazes me what they come up with. I love Legos as a play tool. How about humor? Is there room for humor in this purposeful play? And is it important to leadership?
Yes, I would argue yes. And I think so. Research suggests that to be the case. Like Robert Half has, done a lot of research that humor, there's evidence that employees who see their leaders as having a sense of humor, they're more engaged, they're more motivated. I mean, let's be real right now. Well-being is such an important topic, especially in this COVID world that we're in. And, having, if we're spending most of our working days working in the office, there is an element of fun. And I think a lot of times fun gets equated to not being serious. And I think it's important to know that we can do very serious work and still have fun while we're at it. Is everything fun? No. Should everything be right. No, that's not what we're talking about. But it's really important to think about humor in its appropriate way. So there's a group out at Stanford, a couple professors now that have published some books about humor at play. And I think it's actually, yes, humor seriously. It's on the bookshelf, right? Humor seriously. And so there's more and more research around, and Stanford Business School, I think, is actually teaching classes on humor in the workplace. Now, it has to be important what kind of humor, because I've also, and I'm sure you have, been in places where someone thought it would be funny to say this, and you're like, inappropriate, right? So humor has to be, and it's a skill that can be learned, because some people are like, I'm not funny. It's not about being the stand-up comedian, right? It's about how do I use we'll call it affiliated humor to find those points of connection. Right? And it's not to take anyone down. It's not to sort of belittle, because we know the harm that it can cause. But sometimes just the right amount of humor at the right moment can shift, right? Can just shift a tense moment. It can shift a tough dynamic. It can also invite people, again, to allow themselves to release, again, some of those very limiting beliefs or stories that we have, right? And the example of just, as I mentioned to you earlier, on this amazing, I was very lucky and being on this project for the last year with 86 people from 61 countries, all leaders from different sectors on DIA, diversity, equity, inclusion, equity. This is tough stuff, right? For many of these individuals, some of their whole identity means life or death, right? And we definitely had some very tough discussions, but we made sure that we had some purposeful play, a bit of humor, because it allows our brain to kind of open up that space for those tough discussions. Sometimes even certain humors can protect people from burnout, right? We look at caretakers, for example, it can actually be sort of a real difference between burnout. And as we know in this space, while wellness has become and should be more important in the workplace, there's that element of it.
The last part of centeredness that you talk about is this idea of active agency. Agency is a powerful term these days. And, whether it's dealing with change or conflict, leaders often feel that they're kind of, in quotes here, at the effect of their circumstances or maybe at what others are doing rather than in control. In those sorts of circumstances, what can leaders do to avoid overreacting or maybe the other extreme, which would be doing nothing, instead positively influencing the outcome and the direction that their team is going?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is something that, and again, by the way, all of this is, in the process of sort of learning and seeking, because if I had all the answers, it'd be great. Why don't? But I think, agency, it is a very powerful thing to really remember, because self-efficacy, this is Badur's work, right? That self-efficacy is one of the most critical components for any individual to feel like we have meaning and purpose in our work, right? And it's this idea we know from, Martin Seligman's work, for example. We can learn helplessness, we can learn optimism, all of those things to be about. And yes, there are many things completely out of control, right? If you've got a restructuring going on, right? I'm working with a group right now that the whole reorganization, everyone is feeling like, what do I do, right? And one of the pieces of agency is to recognize what do we have control and what don't we have control. And I know it sounds kind of simplistic to say, that the only thing we do have control is our thoughts, our actions, our responses to things. But when we pay more attention to that, it's sort of back to Stephen Covey's, right? Spheres of influence and spheres of control. Yep. When we pay more attention to those, the things that we can control, our spheres of influence actually can get bigger. Why? Because when we're bringing that intentional focus, we start to sort of separate or at least give greater clarity to those areas that I can have some influence over and not ruminate over the things that I really don't have control over. Now, does that mean I ignore it, right? Like if I could wave my wand and say climate change or race relations, I would. I as a person I don't think one person sort of has, right, necessarily the ability to control some of those big things, but every action that I do can have that ripple effect. And leaders in particular, as we know, leaders' actions, leaders' thoughts, leaders' behaviors have the largest emotional and real life ripple effects, to everything around that. And so recognizing that agency that we do have and the choice we have, and this is where centeredness comes into play, is that it allows us to better discern what's the most appropriate action in this moment, because the only choice I have is this moment right now. And it's a choice. And if I choose inaction, that's still a choice. Because oftentimes we think I'm just going to pretend it's not working, it's not happening, and therefore I'm not responsible. Inaction is a choice. And sometimes inaction is the wisest thing you can do, right? Silence sometimes is the wisest thing we can do. And the invitation for leaders particularly is to use it intentionally, use it and choose that action rather than that external locus of, explanation or external sort of explanation of things that everything's happening to me, but that I actually have that agency to show up how I can. Can I control you? Not at all. Can I control your impressions of it? I can't. But I can control my thoughts, my behaviors, my responses to perhaps influence you.
The power of choice. Thank you.
So the second C of your compassion strategy is courage. How do you define courage, and how can leaders practice it to show up in a more effective way?
For me, courage is the reason why sort of that really kind of came up as the second big piece of it, goes back to authenticity. And something that I've just been working with leaders, it's oftentimes, again, maybe on paper, we've sort of reached certain levels, right? And I think one of the things I'm sure you know as well through your discussions and your work is that feeling of being really honoring yourself. It's hard, right? It's really hard. And part of compassion also means seeing what is there, right? That's what compassion is about, is seeing what's there, the good, the bad, the ugly. That includes the wonderful, charming parts of ourselves and the less so charming parts of ourselves that we don't necessarily want others to see, right? But it's part of who we are. And so part of compassion, there's also that element, right, that Kristen Neff talks about, which is the self-compassion piece, right? Is also understanding that we all have, this sense of shared humanity, and that, it's not about if we mess up, it's when we mess up. I mess up all the time, right? So we all do this, but it's allowing ourselves to authentically show up as who we are, but also allow others to do that. So it really starts with, again, not just self-awareness, but it is self-awareness. And it's also this real exploration to what really matters to me. What is, and we talked about this before, as Bill George, who's a wonderful person, has really sort of put a lot of thought into this. It's what's our North Star, right? What's that compass that really drives us? How does then all my actions, my behaviors, thoughts show up into that? Is it out of alignment? Because when we're much clearer, and it could be a lifetime of figuring out what that authentic, that North Star is. But the more clear we can be, or at least sort of get it swimming in that direction, the more it helps leaders to discern what is the right course of action, right? And is this in the service? Who is this in the service of what? Who in the service of whom?
I love Bill George's work. I use it in my negotiation piece to talk about how I show up and being consistent, authentic to my values, this idea of authentic integrity. What do you think it is about when leaders can show up in that way and be very authentic to who they are? And again, this idea of authentic integrity that allows them to handle any of the challenges they might face, whether it's a negotiation, maybe it's planning, directing others, maybe it's any sort of the myriad of managerial tasks that leaders are asked to do. Why is this so important?
And another piece that you just mentioned that made me think about this is that it's authenticity with compassion, right, and integrity. And I think that's important because sometimes we can mistake it. Well, this is who I am, and take it or leave it. And so we have to be mindful that when we're talking about this, authenticity is not permission to intentionally hurt or harm, right? Or, all of those less than positive aspects of the power of leadership. But it's really thinking about that importance of integrity. And when we're much more clear about who we are more able to, in some ways, the decisions we make become, it's going to sound really kind of, as strange as I'm saying it becomes less of a personal issue because it's more of a personal issue than vice versa, right? Because it becomes almost very clear about what your core values are, what really drives you. And then it's not about me or you, right? In terms of saying yes to you or saying no to you. William Ury, who I'm sure you're familiar with his work, of course, the classic, getting to yes. The one book I always pretty much tell every person I go, read The Power of the Positive No.
Yeah.
I love this book. It is such a simple, but it's like, wow, why didn't someone teach me this when I was, younger? But that, notion of, well, we're really clear about what our values are, then we can say, it's like the roots of a tree. And then you can be more able to say no to those things that might stretch your values. And that's not saying no to you, right? I'm not saying but I'm saying no to this opportunity so I can say yes to the other ways in which we can stay together. So as a leader, when we sort of bring, and leaders are forced into making some really tough decisions, right? Really tough decisions. And, and sometimes and when we think about it from a compassionate perspective, it allows us to really kind of zoom out when we need to at that 30,000 level, so that because the decisions we might make may impact thousands of people, thousands of lives, right? And as leaders, we need to not forget the humanity in it, and at the same time be able to discern when those decisions are in the service of, whether it's because of the vision of the organization, or maybe it's to ensure that, the commitment is to ensuring the longevity of this organization, whatever it might be. It's to be able to make those tough decisions, but still with humanity. Right. And so when we've heard stories about how, in the past several months where certain leaders may have made certain announcements, tough announcements, in not the most compassionate way, right? And email is not necessarily the best way you want to hear, right? So all of those, entire divisions have been, laid off. And so how do we sort of bring that out? And so that's why courage to me is not just authenticity, but it's that notion of embracing one conflict and reframing that conflict is actually what helps us to innovate and create, right? It's what called, I'm working on this just to say, but instead of just, it's that notion of creative abrasion, where you put two people together to present friction. But how do you sort of embrace it so that it becomes creative and productive abrasion? And then how do you have that notion of candor, but with compassion, I should say, not by, or with compassion.
Hey everyone, Nolan here. I have to jump in and end today's podcast for part A of this show. Be sure to rate, review, and subscribe to the NEGOTIATEx podcast if you haven't already. And also join us next week for part B, this awesome interview. Hey, thanks for checking out this video on NEGOTIATEx TV. If you found any value at all, please hit the subscribe button, hit the notification icon if you want to be notified of future videos. And then we also have a couple videos over here that you might be interested in checking out. If you and your small business, your team are looking to get negotiations or leadership training, then you can head over to NEGOTIATEx.com and learn more about the coaching services we offer. Thanks, and I'll see you over in the next video.